Good afternoon, and thank you for being with us. I'm Lynn Weil, Director of External Affairs with the Center for Security and Emerging Technology, or CSET, at Georgetown University. And we are delighted to welcome you for this discussion of a recently published series of reports on U.S. military investments in artificial intelligence. A link to those reports is on our website, and it was included in the invitation for this event. So you're welcome to follow along there one way or another, especially when we later get to audience Q&A. In a moment, you'll hear from our featured speaker and our moderator, but first, a brief bit of housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are muted, and if you're joining us by computer, we can't see you. If you're on a computer and experience any technical issues, use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to alert us, and a CSET team member will try to help you out. Don't use the chat for anything else just yet, please. We will come back to it in just a bit. And now, it's my pleasure to hand the reins over to our moderator, who will introduce the speaker, Dr. Margarita Konayev. Dr. Reginald Brothers serves as a distinguished fellow for CSET. He is the CEO of New Wave Solutions and previously served as Executive Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of Peraton. During the Obama administration, he was Undersecretary for Science and Technology at the Department of Homeland Security, where he was responsible for a portfolio that included basic and applied research, development, demonstration, testing, and evaluation. Prior to that, he served for 3 years as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Research at the Department of Defense. In this position, he was responsible for policy and oversight of the department's science and technology programs and laboratories. He has also held senior roles at the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, and BAE Systems. Reggie, over to you.
Thank you, Lynn. Margarita Konayev, our speaker, is a research fellow at Georgetown CSET, and she's interested in military applications of AI and Russian military innovation in emerging technologies. Previously, she was a non-resident fellow with the Modern War Institute at West Point, a postdoctoral fellow in the Center for Strategic Studies at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania's Perry Worldhouse. Margarita's research on international security, armed conflict, non-state actors and urban warfare in the Middle East, Russia, and Eurasia has been published by the Journal of Global Security Studies, Conflict Management and Peace Science, French Institute of International Relations, Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, War on the Rocks, Lawfare, and a variety of other outlets. She holds a PhD in political science from the University of Notre Dame, an MA in conflict resolution from Georgetown University, and a BA from Brandeis University. From a national security perspective, AI and autonomy have been identified as priorities for the Department of Defense. And as we all know, the department's true priorities are encoded in its investment plans. As such, Reed and her team have done important and revealing research by evaluating actual S&T investments and have reached important conclusions in terms of the trifold framework of technology, military capabilities, and strategic effect. As she states, today's investments will set the course for the future of AI in national security. Rita?
Wonderful, thank you. All right, let's get started. Reggie, I appreciate the introduction. You already hit on all the interesting and important points of the study and the series of reports that we just published in October. That research took a little under a year, and I'm so excited to be here today and share some of our findings. So the conversation, the talk today is titled Understanding U.S. Military Investments in AI. And that's not a coincidence, because when we started this process, we had a sense that we actually don't have a robust or a comprehensive understanding of precisely what it is that the US military is doing in artificial intelligence. We knew that there was a lot of hype, there was a lot of excitement for investments in military applications of AI, and at the same time, there is a lot of fear as well as fear mongering to an extent when we're looking at these futuristic, almost apocalyptic applications and killer robots and self-directed drones flying around, selecting and deciding on their own targets without much human intervention. We also felt, in a sense, that we were developing a better understanding of what our adversaries are doing in AI than we had a sense of what it is that the US military is doing. So with CSET being a data-driven and an evidence-driven organization, we felt that there was an opportunity to contribute to the conversation and kind of clarify the debate a little bit. And I will start by saying that we could have told several stories based on the reports that we've done. One of them would, and I'm happy to address more in the Q&A, one of them would have said that actually, if you ask me how much the US is spending, the US military is spending on AI research, I can't tell you. And I spent about a year trying to figure that out. That story is a story about how complicated R&D spending is and how complex those documents are to navigate. But the story that we're going to focus on today is more directed towards giving us a better understanding of what's really critical in making sure that as the US military is integrating these technologies into its operations and thinking about getting the desired strategic effects out of them, what are we focusing on and what are we missing? So to give you the bottom line out front here, really, despite all of this hype and I guess the fear and the fear mongering around the use of artificial intelligence in military operations, when we investigated the type of research the US military is doing, a military that is at the cutting edge of technology and military technology more specifically, we found that the artificial intelligence projects are not designed to displace or replace humans, but rather there's a consistent emphasis across the different research programs that are related to autonomy and AI in order to mobilize human-machine teamings. So again, human-machine teaming is a cross-cutting theme across the different US military research programs that pertain to autonomy and AI that we explored. That to some extent perhaps not come to a surprise to people who have followed this debate over the last decade or so. Indeed, human-machine teaming was a concept that was being discussed much before we were even talking about artificial intelligence. However, what did come as a surprise to us, and I would assume to some of the people that are even better familiar with this debate than I am and we are, is the fact that we found that despite the emphasis on human-machine teaming throughout, there is little attention that is being paid to research that centers on the role of trust in human-machine teams. And that gap, in turn, has pretty adverse implications when it comes to US goals in terms of getting the maximum advantages that AI and autonomy promise to deliver in operational settings, and as well as when it comes to leveraging these technologies in order to ensure strategic effects. So that once again, the story we're going to tell today is one that is focused on the role of trust in human-machine teamings and the dangers perhaps that come from understudying this topic. All right, so to quickly go over the agenda for the remainder of my time here, I'm going to introduce you to our analytical approach. I'm a political scientist by training, so my team has suffered through the process of formulating a comprehensive and systematic framework to study a topic that they could have probably studied much faster if I didn't insist on this analytical approach, but here we are nonetheless. And I'll also introduce a few, I'll go over a few of the key findings from our two big reports, the budgetary assessment and the strategic assessment, and conclude with a few recommendations, broadly speaking. All right, so let's get started. As I said, we came to this project without really a clear understanding of what was happening in terms of the US military investments in emerging technologies, specifically in autonomy and AI. And when we were approaching this topic, we really envisioned trying to understand what was happening through examining the relationship between three main concepts. The first one answers the question of what is really happening in autonomy and AI, and that's the element of technology. So here we map the landscape of the different R&D programs that were related to AI. The second is a focus on the question of why is the US military spending these resources, these funds, in order to advance these technological developments. And the why to us became an answer of military capabilities. So we focused on assessing the different military capabilities that are promised to be enabled by breakthroughs in autonomy and artificial intelligence, with a specific focus on speed, precision, coordination, greater reach, persistence, of course, lethality, and military endurance. And finally, the so what. All of these technological advances are exciting, and the capability enhancements are, of course, important, but the so what speaks to the strategic effects of these developments, trying to understand how these advancements could affect US strategic objectives, specifically when it comes to the question of deterring adversaries, the ability to conduct military operations effectively, and of course with in line with the laws of war, and finally our ability to work with allies and be interoperable with our allies. So this analytical approach yielded a report that was entirely too long for anybody who has their head on straight to read in one sitting. So fortunately, I have good and generous bosses who directed me correctly to split it up into two studies. So the budgetary assessment here is focused on the technology component, and the strategic assessment builds on our findings from the budgetary assessment and integrates them into an analysis of capabilities and strategic effects. And as Lynn and Reggie mentioned, all of the reports are available on our website, and we do certainly hope that you will check them out. They are readable in terms of their length now that there's two of them. Let me go over some of the key findings that we came up from the budgetary assessment. Before I even get into the conversation about human-machine teaming and trust, I think it's also worth mentioning that in the process of our examination, what you're seeing here is an analysis of data from the year 2020, focusing on the science and technology program. That means the basic, applied, and advanced research investments by the US Army, Navy, Air Force, and DARPA. We developed two series of keywords queries that scan the descriptions of the different research programs in these documents and identified a set of research programs that were related to autonomy and another set that were related to artificial intelligence. And certainly we did expect, of course, an overlap between these two sets of portfolios, considering the overlap that exists between these two disciplines and these two areas of studies. But I will admit that we were a bit surprised to find that more than 2/3 of the AI-related research efforts are also related to autonomy. And as we know, much of the autonomy portfolio is very much geared towards unmanned systems and unmanned vehicles. So this is to say that the majority of US military research efforts is really going to enabling greater autonomous functionalities in robotics and in physical systems, providing semi-autonomous and autonomous vehicles, drones, ground vehicles, unmanned surface and undersea vehicles the Navy is developing, essentially AI that is going into physical systems. That means that the amount of money and the share of the funds that is directed specifically to AI research that is not related to embodied autonomy is actually relatively small. And that raises some concerns, especially when it comes to questions of cyber operations, cyber defense, and cyber offense. Are we investing sufficiently in those areas, especially when we're thinking about what our adversaries are doing in that space? I study Russia as well, and I think a lot of us are aware that Russia is investing significant amount of research and innovation in the cyberspace and is looking to leverage AI in order to enhance the impact, reach, and scale of its cyber operations as part of its broader information warfare framework. So it's really worth considering, are we doing enough on this front, and what are the implications of this, this significant overlap? But again, perhaps one of the most interesting findings from our research, again, was this cross-cutting focus on human-machine teaming. And when we looked across different sets of, different buckets of technologies and applications and research projects that were looking to leverage AI and greater autonomy for unmanned systems, for information processing, decision support, different targeting functions throughout the targeting process, we noticed that human-machine teaming was, again, a consistent theme. So this is research that is not directed towards replacing humans or displacing humans. Rather, it is research that is specifically meant to advance intelligent technologies that interact, collaborate, and integrate with soldiers, with humans, in a way that enhances and augments human intelligence and human capabilities, with the optimal goal of optimizing performance for humans, for machines, and for the human-machine teams across a whole range of environments and mission sets. So really, if you look into some of these examples, for instance, we know that the U.S. Army Next Generation Combat Vehicle is the flagship program of the future of the combat vehicle research. And even within there, we see a significant focus on AI and machine learning software and algorithms that are meant to team with soldiers, and advancing research that looks into machine learning and reinforcement learning that is meant to enable joint human intelligence decision-making in order to build and create adaptive, agile teams. So it's funny when you think about unmanned systems and unmanned vehicles with the idea that you're removing humans out of there, but the point is that you're absolutely not doing that completely, because you're still focusing on human-machine teaming. The same is true when it comes to information processing and decision support technologies. For one useful example is, again, from the Army applied research on expeditionary data decisions technology that looks to develop AI to provide relevant and available data that is useful, not just data to information to knowledge, from situational awareness to situational understanding, providing the type of information that is useful, that is for time critical decisions, and helps people, helps commanders make the optimal decisions in hard, tough situations. And what's really interesting here is this emphasis on presenting the information in the context that is in alignment with complex cognitive human needs. So once again, not displacing the humans, but augmenting the capabilities and their intelligence with an emphasis of being adaptable to the way that people think and process information. And finally, even within the targeting functions, which we know can be a complicated and often controversial conversation, we are still seeing research that is focused on working together with the human, with the human operator, with the human teammate across the different stages of the targeting functions, and the purpose to reduce their workload, the work on the analyst, with the ultimate goal of enhancing the robustness and the capabilities of the entire warfighting system. So to reiterate, really cross-cutting focus on human-machine teaming across all of these different dimensions, all of these research areas. Of course, not all of them are by any means pertain to human-machine teaming, but what is clear is that this this theme is really evident all throughout, regardless of how we cut and dice and slice the different areas of focus the US military is working on. Let's see here. Oh, excuse me. So as we know that it's a pretty non-controversial statement at this point that trust is quite critical to effective human-machine teaming. And that is true, at least in part, because trust really affects the willingness of people to accept recommendations and to be able to count on their autonomous and AI-enabled systems. So while, again, we weren't necessarily surprised by the prominence and of human-machine teaming across the different research programs that were related to autonomy and AI, when we saw that, we kind of expected that there was also going to be an emphasis on understanding how trust works in this context. But as you heard me say in the beginning, that is not what we found. In fact, the gap here is quite significant. When we went over and searched for the word trust across the different research initiatives, we found that only 18 out of the 789 research components that were classified as related to autonomy, and only 11 out of the 287 research components that were classified as related to AI also contained the word trust. So that's a surprising and perhaps in many ways a concerning oversight, because we have this assumption that seems to be widely shared that trust is important for effective human-machine coordination, collaboration, and teaming, yet we are not actively studying it. We are not working to better understand it. What is interesting, though, is that in part, this gap reflects what is happening with the literature and the research outside of the US military as well, where the pace and the development of technology has outpaced the research that is being done on the topic. So a lot of what we know about human-machine collaboration and human-machine teaming and trust and questions like the trust gap or automation bias, those types of terms, they've been introduced to us based on studies that explored systems that were far less sophisticated from what we have today. Much of that research looked into expert systems and looked into automation. There isn't really that much currently available, especially in the context of military setting, that looks directly and specifically into working with AI, working with extremely sophisticated technologies. And all of that, this level of advancement in technology, of course, has implications for human-machine interactions and human-machine relationships. So clearly this gap is significant, and it's not only the US military that is understudying this topic, but it does tell us that this is a topic that is very much ripe for exploration and is important to do so. I also want to present a few of the key findings that we have from our strategic assessment. If you remember from the beginning of the conversation when I presented about our our analytical framework, the budgetary assessment looked into the technology part, while the strategic assessment tried to understand how are these investments and technologies are going to influence US military capability, and in turn, how they're going to influence the US ability to deliver on strategic interests. And the good news is that in our assessment, DoD research investments in autonomy and AI are in fact targeting the correct set of military capabilities. Perhaps I shouldn't say correct, but appropriate, useful, relevant set of military capabilities that should be able to help the U.S. military and the government, the department more broadly, to deliver on its desired goals, those being the strategic goals of deterrence, interoperability, and military effectiveness. So just a few quick examples here. When we're thinking about AI-enabled speed and decision-making and in operations, there's the prospect that it can strengthen and enhance deterrence, prevent adversaries from attack if they understand that our speed of response can even outpace their initial attack. They will be dissuaded from aggression. We also know that AI-enabled systems can increase situational awareness, reduce response time, and really help weave together this common operational picture that provides coordination and helps allies work together, advances interoperability. And lastly here, we know that there's a lot of excitement and for good reasons around AI applications for logistics and sustainment. Some of the stuff that can come from the commercial sector and improve back office operations, but also things that are more related to combat support functions. Streamlining logistics, of course, is related to improving military readiness. And when we're talking about questions of timely resupply, well-functioning, well-maintained equipment, all of that is extremely relevant to military endurance, the ability to persevere under difficult circumstances and hostile environments until the mission is accomplished. And in turn, all of that is meant to augment and contribute to military effectiveness. So this is to say that the DoD is very much on track in terms of its investments when it comes to these military capabilities that contribute to achieving our broader strategic goals. That said, once again, if we're talking about the fact that human-machine teaming is quite critical in a lot of these relationships and effects, and we are still not sufficiently investing in understanding the role of trust, we are risking undermining progress in a way that not only hurts our ability to deliver on the technology, but even more importantly, our ability to deliver in terms of enhancing these military capabilities and achieving the strategic goals that we set to ourselves. So consider the fact that, for instance, trust is important for our ability to work with allies. When we're looking at this coordination issue. But we also know that there's some research that indicates that trust is affected by cultural factors and national factors that influence how people approach and view and relate to technology. So if we're in a situation where we're sharing a theater and in the midst of a multinational operation, and there are allied commanders who do not feel the same level of trust towards AI-enabled systems, there's going to be a price to pay in terms of coordination, in terms of cohesion, interoperability, and even the long-term viability of our alliances. So that's just one example, but we can think about how all of these issues play out when it comes to different applications, even applications that seem to be relatively uncontroversial and safe and attainable when it comes to logistics and sustainment. When these technologies are deployed specifically in combat support operations, trust is going to be quite pivotal in order to ensure that they deliver on the desired effects. Really, I think that it's quite important to understand that unless commanders and operators and human teammates can trust the technology that they're with, at best, the technology proves to be a distraction, but at worst, it is a danger, something that can be quite a life or death situation. So let me just conclude with a few recommendations and observations. The Department of Defense clearly has a very ambitious vision for artificial intelligence for military purposes, including the goal of developing and fielding these intelligence technologies as ultimately as trusted partners to human operators across a whole different set of missions and environments, including in combat. In order to achieve this, we believe that the US military still has some way to go in developing a concrete and much more cohesive and complete understanding of the role of trust in human-machine teams. In particular, we think that it's important to invest more resources in understanding this relationship, specifically in operational conditions, because we know that it is not only humans who conduct themselves differently under situations of stress and high risk, but also these technologies. AI is a new technology, and as such, it is quite vulnerable in uncontrolled conditions and uncontrolled situations. So as we're researching and developing them, it's important to move beyond the lab conditions and simulations to really think about how do we test these, how do we study these technologies and these relationships in operational settings. The other point here speaks to the coordination with allies. If there are indeed divergences in how the United States and its allies approach technology and trust technology, we need to get in front of that in order to ensure it does not end up hurting or undermining interoperability when we work with allies in the future. So that's one point. And second point is Reggie started off when he introduced this presentation, he said that our investments today, our decisions about investments in US military research today are going to set the course for the future of artificial intelligence in national security and military affairs. So in order for the United States to ensure its advantages, whether it's technologically or strategically or militarily, into the long term, we believe that it's important to start now, but by investing and prioritizing trustworthy AI technologies. And that means gaining a better understanding not only of what influences human approaches to technology, but also what makes the technologies much more trustworthy and dependable and reliable and secure, resilient, robust. All of these adjectives, which one of them matter the most and in what ways when it comes to ensuring the effectiveness of human-machine teams, these are still open questions to a great extent. We also would argue that it's important to invest and investigate these questions early on in the development cycle, starting with basic research and advancing through a more of an iterative model of development that grows on feedback from users, because ultimately it is these people who are going to be utilizing the technology once again in life and death situations. And if that technology cannot be trusted, then we are not putting ourselves in a situation where we can fully leverage these incredible, sophisticated, exquisite developments and technological advances to get the military capabilities that we need in order to ensure the strategic outcomes that we want. And I will close just by saying that as much as I'd like to claim credit for everything, that is by no means the truth. I have a wonderful team working with me at CSAT. They've all contributed significantly to this set of reports. And once again, you can find more information on our website, subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on Twitter, and even for some ungodly reason you want to follow me on Twitter or get in touch via email, here's the information. And I'm looking forward to your questions and to our conversation. So I'm gonna end the show here now and listen to Reggie.
Thank you, Rita. Before Reggie comes on, I just want to make sure that everybody knows we'll make time for questions and comments on this very insightful presentation. Reggie gets to exercise the moderator's prerogative and kick off the Q&A himself. And in the meantime, if anyone would like to ask a question, please type it in the chat and it will be read aloud. Those who are phoning in for this meeting will not be able to ask questions, and we thank you for understanding the technical limitations here. Reggie, take it away, and I'll jump in as needed during the Q&A.
Lynn, thank you. Rita, thank you very much. Great presentation. I want to start, I had some experience when I was at the Pentagon, and I was asked to look at the cyber S&T investments. And one challenge was actually bidding them, come up with a taxonomy, which you had a way of looking at that, right? You had a whole list of the keywords you're looking for. Another challenge I had, quite frankly, was trying to figure out, given the bidding, what the impact was across those bins. Was there coordination in those S&T programs across those bins? And that has impact, if you're thinking about it, on the effectiveness of the S&T research. I was wondering your thoughts on that, if you were able to glean any information on that in the work you did.
Okay. That's an interesting question. So thinking about how everything is part of a joint mission, I guess, in a sense, and how these investments come together. So I guess we were trying to understand, coming to it from an understanding that we could bin these, because we're still early in the development cycle, we could bin the potential applications of these research initiatives in many different ways. Some of them, we categorize as related to autonomous, unmanned and systems and vehicles, but they also had elements of decision support in them and information processing. So it really varies. So we saw that there were a few research programs that were really all encompassing and had more of a system approach. Others that were perhaps earlier in the development cycle only were interested in exploring certain aspects. I guess the way that we saw them coming together was through this understanding of how they're going to impact military capabilities, how they're going to feed into this ability to conduct operations at a greater speed, to make decisions more accurate, to use force more precisely, to enable greater reach and greater persistence. So the fusion, I guess, of these technologies coming together for us really was accomplished at that capability level. And then we try to assess how those combined capabilities translated to strategic effects, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah, thank you, Rita. Now I'm going to go to some of the questions from the audience.
Of course.
One of them is, rather than trust, is the research instead not focused on explainable AI? Say with DARPA's XAI initiative, in which trust would be a subset of being explainable. What are your thoughts?
I know that there's a back and forth of a bit of a conversation about explainability and trust. And the argument against the necessity of explainability is that we don't fully comprehend the way that people are making decisions. It's often, the ultimate, we've heard people say that the ultimate black box is not the AI system, it's the human brain. Yet we are able to trust our friends, our co-workers, our teammates, our co-fighters in life and death situations, even without understanding why they make the decisions that they do. On the other hand, there is also experimental research that shows that explainability is important and that helps advance and support trust. I think one of the most interesting studies that I've read looked into the interaction between explainability and reliability. And the finding there showed that people tend to trust, people are affected and trust technologies more when they're able to explain themselves. But when the system is reliable, then that explanation doesn't really have that much of an effect. So I think that's really interesting because it tells us that these variables, explainability, transparency, reliability, whatnot, they don't exist in isolation. The interactions between them, I think, are one of the most critical things to study, because you don't only have one characteristic of a system, you have a whole set of them and they interact, and all of that influences the relationship with humans.
Thanks, Rita. Another question came in, and it's really saying that a lot of the emphasis that the work that you're doing, that you're looking at, this AI work, some of the algorithms, some of the models, some of the frameworks are somewhat agnostic to the applications. And as such can be either applied to kind of edge users, some of the more dangerous, more sensitive missions, or they can be used for back office applications, which are safer in the questioner's parlance. Have you seen much work to suggest we're looking at trust in these safe spaces versus the more sensitive areas?
Okay, let me think back. So as I presented, there was only a few instances where the word trust even came up. From what I remember, it was in some research that was explicitly geared to one's understanding the process of decision making. So as part of decision making, what helps or doesn't help trust. But it's also useful to remember that we looked at the early stage of these technologies. So for the most part, we weren't really getting to the state, to a differentiation between where they're going to be employed, whether it's going to be in combat setting or not in combat setting. But I think it's a relationship that's important regardless of whether it's going to be used by edge users or back office operators. Maybe the dimensions are different and the parameters differ, and the nature of trust is, can vary, but it's still important. It's still an empirical question about whether it matters or not in what settings, right? If we still can't answer it, or maybe I can't. If somebody in the audience can, that would be great. But don't tell me, because we're working on a project.
Thanks, Rita. Another question asked about, you and I were talking the other day about just AI and autonomy, and you mentioned today how there's this Venn diagram of overlap between the funding, right? One of the questioners really talks about, to what degree does the military conflate robotics, autonomy, machine learning, and AI? And how can we mitigate the problems that might result from that conflation?
That's a very good question. And it's important to state that a lot of it depends on the way that you operationalize these variables. A lot of it depends on how you choose to define autonomy, how you choose to define robotics, AI, machine learning. And that stuff is intertwined, of course. And those interactions are important, and the way that you choose to categorize it is going to in some ways influence what you're finding. But we approached it in several ways, and that overlap persisted. So I think what it does tell us is, despite the fact that there seems to be somewhat separate buckets of money in terms of the actual research that is being done, there is a significant overlap. So whether that's a question of definitions, whether it's a question of how we did our research, or whether it's just the nature of the beast and the fact that these fields of study are interrelated, or maybe it is in fact a conscious choice to focus on AI-enabled autonomy in physical systems and in robotics. Perhaps it is a conscious choice, and it's a choice that makes a lot of sense. But if it is, I think it's worth having the conversation that this was a decision for reasons X, Y, Z that very much aligned with our strategic goals. In the end of the day, for me, coming to the study of technology and national security, I'm a national security person. I want to know what the technology is doing for me on a strategic level, in the effort to ensure that the US military is prepared for all contingency that could expect it.
Before we go further on those kind of questions, I want to go back to kind of a process question. Someone asked, what categories of research did you include in your study? Did you look 6.1, 6.2, 6.3, 6.4, T&E? What were the kinds of things you looked at?
Yeah, so we looked at basic, applied, and advanced, so science and technology. We didn't venture into the rest of them. There was only that many of us, especially when we were just getting started. And it ended up being quite a complex process, trying to, get at that information and trying to how to decide how to operationalize it. But I know now that perhaps in retrospect, it wasn't the worst decision, because there isn't very much being done on AI when it comes to T&E. So I think we wouldn't have found that much more stuff in T&E. And I think our decision to focus on the earlier part of the technology development cycle was useful. But on that note, CSET published a report with Michelle Fournoy and WestX Advisors that we did a webinar on a few months or weeks, I don't know, time at this point, this is very strange, that looked into T&E and AI and T&E and building trust in that context. That is also an interesting, topic to explore if you're so inclined. It should be on our website. Yes, I believe it was last month. Mm-hmm.
Another question has to do with just kind of where we are in terms of understanding these systems. A question was asked with respect to human-machine teaming. It's early in these days of thinking about this. So the questioner was asking, is it a surprise that we're developing these systems without thinking about that right now, as opposed to get understanding that, look, we're just starting to understand kind of the best way to use these systems?
So it really depends on how you define human-machine teaming, if you want to say it's early. As I mentioned, there's studies that go back to at least the 80s that looked into trust in automated systems as a result of some malfunctions of autopilots in the aviation industry, and trying to explain what happened there. We've had systems with some degree of automation and autonomy since at least the 50s, if not before that. So the interactions, one as some sort of collaborations between human and machines, has been prominent as part of military operations for a long time now. What is different now is the level and exquisiteness and advancement of the technology itself. The technology itself right now is incredibly and increasingly sophisticated, and at the same time, it's still quite volatile and brittle and can fail in unexpected and ununderstandable ways. So I think that is the nature of the human-machine teaming that is different now. And also another dimension perhaps is the integration that we're expecting between human and machines, is how closely they're going to work together and how they're expected to share and distribute tasks. So perhaps as this, as the technology becomes more sophisticated and you're able to allocate more and different higher levels of intelligence of tasks to it, then their entire relationship evolves. And that's where we should be continuing to study.
Rita, we've talked about this as well. How aware do you think the DoD is of the challenges of assurance, security, and trust as challenges to actually adoption of AI and autonomy?
I'm sorry, what's the last sentence?
Yeah, the issue is, you mentioned trust as being a challenge to the adoption of this technology. The questioner asked whether or not security assurance are also challenged, and how aware do you think the DoD is of that, given the research that you did?
Okay. So like I said, we could have told several stories from this research. And one of the stories was that when we scanned and went through and read the descriptions of the different research programs, we've identified a number of programs that were directly and explicitly targeted to studying assurance, to studying security, to trying to ensure robustness and resilience, and being able to protect against counter AI or counter autonomy attacks, and to be able to have these systems be resilient to adversarial manipulation. For sure, there are programs that are explicitly dedicated to these issues. At the same time, though, I can't say that we noticed that safety and security with its various adjectives and attributes is necessarily a consistent theme throughout. So that's kind of adds to the conversation about trust, right? Like I mentioned, trust is on the one hand about the attitudes that humans have towards technology, and on the other hand, about the attributes of the technology itself. So if we're already kind of being shortchanged on understanding what is driving the attitudes of humans towards technology, and perhaps we're also not investing enough in understanding what makes technology safe and secure and reliable and therefore trustworthy, then we're kind of, you know, between a rock and a hard place when it comes to using them later on. And not that much later on either.
So let's continue down this path on trust. There's a nuanced question that came in that asked about, where is trust more important? Is trust more important at the end user, or is it more important, as they say, at the decision-making level, which is really, has someone decided the system is trustworthy?
That's an insightful and a complicated question, right? I think it's going to depend. It's going to be contingent on the nature of the operations, and it's going to be contingent on the environment and the technology itself. And I think it's also important to think, and this is by no means my idea, this is just some of the feedback that we've got on our recent research on trust in human machine teams. It's important to not just think about the human and the technology and the interactions between them. It's useful to also think about the broader systems that are around people and the organizations, the culture that influences how people make decisions and how people feel and experience technology. So it is perhaps possible that in a particular organization, in a particular culture, if it is the decision maker, the commander that says the technology is trustworthy, that may be good enough for the operators. But in another organization, it might not be sufficient, and the operators may feel more empowered or more skeptical to doubt the technology or to trust the technology when the commander doesn't. So there's, like, you know, I started by saying that human attitudes are important, and then the variables that are related to technology itself are important, but even more broadly, understanding the organization, understanding the culture, understanding what's around the human machine team is also significant to know under what conditions trust is going to matter at which level.
You know, I've got another process question for you, Rita. This is on how you actually define trust.
Yeah. Okay, so I don't think we got into the nitty-gritty of defining trust in this report, because like I said, this is just one of the stories that we told. But in the work that we're developing now that looks into trust in human machine teams, I think trust is the appropriate level that you believe the technology is going to do what it's supposed to do based on its capabilities. So that was a very terrible answer, and I apologize for that. I can't remember at the top of my head, but it is the relationship between the reliability of the technology and your knowledge of its capabilities is your assessment of how much stake you want to give it, a contingent on what you know it can do.
Got it. What about investment in AI for cybersecurity systems? Steve Welby, hey Steve, made the comment that sometimes it's hard to decouple whether or not the ML for cybersecurity is really accurately reflected in the budget documents. Any thought about did you find any of that in your work?
So I think that may be very well possible. I think where we found it in our work is in that sliver of projects that are AI that is not related to autonomy. Autonomy, at least for the most part, in physical systems. So it's possible. And I mean, I remember reading through like AI for cyber defense and AI for cyber offense. Those programs absolutely do exist. The question is how extensive they are and what precisely they focus on and how attuned they are to the threat landscape as as it's being developed, because it's obviously an area where adversaries are very much bent on gaining an advantage. It's critical for them. It's an area where at least Russia, from what I know, is bent on making sure that it overcomes a lot of its other disadvantages. So that's where it's important for them. So I can't explicitly say what percentage of the investments are going to cyber. I know that they're there, but it's also, it's also very possible that some of that stuff is secret.
True, very true. Actually, that goes to another question. Someone asked about that. I mean, do you think a lot of the research, if you're not finding more of this basic AI research, could that be in classified domains, which obviously you wouldn't have access to?
I mean, yes, that's not, of course, impossible. I can't know what I don't know, right? But at the same time, it seems that there is opportunities to study these topics, not necessarily in the classified arena. Like, these are questions that we can use FFRDCs to answer. These are questions that we can use the military labs to answer in lab conditions or even in experimental settings. Like, these questions can be delegated to universities, to engineering departments. There's under Minerva and social science, there's a lot of opportunities to study this at cost. So yeah, sure, I imagine there's a lot of stuff that exists in secret, but the fact that it's such a small part of what is visible and a lot is visible, then it makes me wonder, right?
Yeah, and I get it. Here's an interesting question. I think we'll call on not just the research you did here, but also the background of some of your other work. Argument was that speed will enhance deterrence. Will acceleration of decision processes not lead to more instability due to reduced reaction time and higher readiness levels? What are your thoughts?
Wait, I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Yes, sorry, I probably read that too fast. Argument was that speed will enhance deterrence. The acceleration of decision processes not lead to more instability due to reduced reaction time and higher readiness levels?
Absolutely, that is a possibility as well. And I think a lot of it is, again, contingent. It wasn't an either or dichotomy. What I highlighted was just one aspect in which AI-enabled speed and decision-making in operations can influence deterrence, but there's absolutely counter arguments to that. My point was that it's in many ways contingent on the human-machine teaming and collaboration involved in that process, because effective human-machine teams can moderate some of the risks that come from speed and come from system complexity and come from, the types of risks that these complex, often fragile, but extremely fast systems may pose. If the relationship is solid and is built on trust and built on an understanding of trust contingent on the capabilities of the system, then that should reduce the risks that come from greater speed. But I am by no means denying that those exist, of course.
Got it. There's a question about your thesis that there should be more investment in AI. Instead of, there's too much in AI, not necessarily autonomy. One of the folks in the audience says, if 2/3 of the money is in autonomy, given the fact from the questioner's perspective, autonomy is more complicated than AI, is this then not a reasonable distribution of funding?
I mean, I don't know if I know enough to say that AI is less complicated than autonomy necessarily. I'm also not fully convinced that the majority of useful functions out of AI in military systems is necessarily in embodied autonomy. which is where the funding for autonomy tends to skew, is for unmanned systems and unmanned vehicles. I am also, the people who know me have heard me rant about this. I'm a bit of a skeptic when it comes to certain investments, when it comes to like unmanned ground vehicles and their viability in, the landscape of future conflicts, specifically in urban operations. So, I mean, I generally have doubts on some of those investments in general and whether they're autonomy and AI enabled in specific. My point here, and I think our point, is to just, the talk is called Understanding US Investments in AI. And what we're doing is showing that if we want to understand, then we have to confront the fact that for better or for worse, this overlap between autonomy and AI is significant. So that means that something else is being shortchanged. And that's fine, one way or another. Like, you have to make decisions, you have to allocate funds, you have to decide what's more important and what's more significant from a capabilities perspective and a strategic effects perspective. But if we're making those decisions, we need to be making them contingent on the strategic environment and who are our adversaries and what they are doing. Not necessarily in response to them, but even in the way to be able to get ahead of them, for sure.
Sure. I appreciate, I really appreciate your, just personally, I appreciate your international experience in the way you approach this, because there's a question here about how do you think our investments in AI will impact NATO, and I could expand that. How do you think our investments in AI/autonomy impacts other investments internationally?
Other investments internationally, or what
Yeah.
other nations are doing in AI and autonomy?
The latter. What other nations are investing in AI? Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a difficult question that I struggle with a lot, because I know that, the United States has this, and the United States military, although it perhaps doesn't feel that way, and friends from DoD might disagree, but there is a lot of leeway in being rich. Like, we're talking about making decisions and making cuts and making priorities, but I think in many ways, when you have this much money, it is often the case that you just invest in everything, and you have room to make mistakes and room to learn, and it's really, really wonderful and great. But that is just not the situation for a lot of our allies. And the inevitably increasing gap in military capabilities and technological capabilities between the United States and its allies is something that is really important to keep track of and trace off as we're thinking about collaboration in AI, and we're thinking about interoperability, and we're thinking about the long-term health of our alliances and burden sharing. And all of this is without even talking about politics and economics and populist sentiments and whatnot. But I think the United States, the decision makers here are well aware that our allies are restricted in what they can do. But fortunately, AI is an interesting area where you don't necessarily need to have a massive military industrial complex in order to advance innovation. So there are areas for really, promising and fruitful collaboration with our allies in AI that don't necessitate the type of a defense budget that the United States has. And AI is quite unique in that, because of the fact that so much innovation comes from the commercial space. So it's not.
The question that someone asked is, how does the DoD investments relate to with respect to commercial, right?
Wait, say that again. How do DoD investments relate to what?
To commercial investments in AI and autonomy. I mean, do you think, how is it balanced? Because you're looking at the investments, but a lot of this does a DoD investment, but a lot of the technology development does come from the commercial world. So any sense of the magnitude difference there? I don't know if you can relate to other CSET research or not to ascertain that.
I think it's, it's well known that it is the commercial space and the private companies who now lead on R&D globally, and I think perhaps even within the United States. And I think Melissa Flagg's research speaks to that. Should again be on our website. Of course, there are areas of overlap, and there are applications from the civilian space that can really, seamlessly transition or relatively easily transition into some of the functionalities of the Department of Defense. But there inevitably are going to be areas that only the military can do, because that's the type of tasks and missions that only the military does. So there's never going to be a space that can be fully filled by what the commercial world is doing. In-house innovation is absolutely critical, and investment in in-house capabilities and brain power and resources for the infrastructure for that innovation is beyond critical.
This next question, it's kind of outside the scope of this particular research, but I think you might have some interesting thoughts on it. In the beginning of the talk, you mentioned how you made sure that you followed a certain process. One of the members of the audience asked, how would you recommend we actually study human machine teaming? Do you have any thoughts on how we should set up a study like that, or studies like that?
Well, it depends what sort of the discipline and what sort of applications you're interested in. I would start with narrowing it down. It's whatever it is. If you're interested in human machine teaming, find the aspect of it that is perhaps most compelling. So we know that trust is important for effective collaboration between humans and machines. But Reggie and you and I talk. Not to show all of our cards here, but you and I talked about the vulnerabilities of human machine teams, and the fact that we don't sufficiently understand the interface, not the interface, but the landscape of vulnerabilities that are unique to the interaction between humans and machines, that are not only human vulnerabilities or system vulnerabilities, but are in this space where they overlap and collaborate. So that's another, don't steal that idea, whoever asked. Give us some time to write it, and then you can cite it.
So kind of going to almost an outcome here, how would you, based on what you are finding, it was difficult to find investments in AI research. How are we to go forward and understand how much we should invest in kind of this next step of AI engineering? The question specifically asks about AI engineering, right? So not just research in algorithms, data management, these kinds of things, but specifically how to AI engineer, how to use this stuff. But how do we get any idea of order of magnitude what we should spend, not just what we might be spending on research right now?
So I would say that that's not necessarily, I don't like how questions, I like why questions.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that, like, of course, we want to know how much we're spending, and we want to know, because that's a good comparative question when we're looking at China and we're thinking about, strategically competing and who has the edge and what. But the question really, before we talk about how much, we got to be asking why. What do we want these systems to do? What are they capable of doing, and what are some of their shortcomings that we need to resolve in order for them then to do what it is we need them to do? So I think before we even talking about how much, we need to have a better strategic vision and operational vision of where these systems are useful and perhaps even necessary, or where they can make the most difference, where they can have the greatest impact at an operational strategic way. I think it's important to make these smart choices before we're even talking about how much. That's one way to not answer a question, but
very skillfully done.
Yeah.
So here's a why question. You state that trust has not been taken into account enough. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is? Why do you think that trust has not been taken into account thus far?
So that's really fascinating, right? Like I've only recently started asking about why is it not there. And at first I was very worried that maybe we're missing something, maybe it's being done somewhere else. But after, getting kind of feedback, it seems that we're not completely off our rocket here and we're not off base. It does seem that this is an understudied area. I think perhaps there is a sense or an assumption that if the thing works, then I'm going to trust it. And all I needed to do is, if we ensure that the system is functional and reliable, then that's good enough for me to employ it and use it. Then it will be trustworthy. So perhaps we equate reliability with trustworthiness, which, you know, for better or worse, there is research that indicates that reliability is important for building and maintaining trust in human machine teams. That could be one aspect. Another aspect is possibly that there's you know, an expectation or a tacit assumption that this research is being done elsewhere. Maybe it's being done in industrial settings, maybe it's being done in places where people use industrial robots and work closely, you know, in manufacturing or whatnot. Or even in service, trying to understand how intelligence agents and systems, how do we rely on them to make decisions for us on what to buy, where to shop, what to click on. Clearly, this is a technology that is prevalent in many other places, in everywhere, really. It's on our phones, it's on our TV, it's everywhere. Maybe there's an assumption that we can draw insights from commercial and private places and spaces, and I have reservations about that because of the nature of the operational environment. And, you know, military settings are not commercial settings, and you can't expect that things are going to be the same, including the vulnerabilities of both people and machines there. But I can't tell you clearly why, for one reason, this is such a gap. All I know is that it seems to be, and that is something that I think we should be addressing.
One other thing to think about, I'm not sure if you can actually answer this, but a question was asked about how to ensure interoperability, that for example, for our international partners, you know, we're talking about trust among our own systems and people. Thoughts on how we can help ensure trust among our allies in our systems for interoperability purposes?
So the question is whether they need to be trusting our system, or whether we need to be, or they need to be developing their own systems that they design very specifically to match their attributes and their organizational culture and their chains of command and processes of decision making, because those can vary. Military organizations, you know, they don't all work the same. They have different standards and operating procedures and whatnot. So assuming that not everyone is going to have the same technology as the United States, there's still a conversation to be had about allies, you know, learning to operate with some of the more advanced technologies on our end. And you have procedures for that, whether it's with the standardization agreements within NATO, making sure that, you know, systems and hardware is interoperable. But I think even before we're getting to the nitty-gritty, there needs to be a conversation about working collaboratively on some of these developments with our allies. And there is interest in both, you know, both on the side of the United States and many of our allies who do want to be working on joint standards for development of these technologies, and, you know, research and development. So there's a lot of opportunity, but we need to start actually doing it and not just talking about it. And I think Jake has already like an important initiative in the AI Partnership for Defense that seems to be, you know, one of the, it seems to be like a really unique undertaking, bringing together what I think it's close to like 13 different countries or defense organizations for collaboration. So there are definitely smart people working and thinking about this, but it needs to be codified and taken a step farther and faster because the technology is advancing.
Thank you. I'm staying with kind of the international theme, Rita.
Mhm.
A lot of concern about ethics of these systems, and there's concerns about, will lethal action by autonomous vehicles be prohibited? Let's say that happens. How might that affect the investments the United States has?
So I think the conversation again goes back to accountability and responsibility within the operating procedures and of the Department of Defense, within the ethical principles that DoD has adopted earlier in the year, within the laws of war, within international humanitarian law. There's a disposition, there's an ascription of responsibility to the human. The human is responsible for their decisions of how they employ the means and methods of war. And that's where technology fits in. And that is regardless of, in my opinion, of the attributes of that technology. At a certain point in the development cycle of that technology, or in the deployment cycle of that technology, a human was involved and a decision was made. Where in the chain of command that human is, whether it's going to be the operator or the commander or the general or the Secretary of Defense or the president, who is going to be eventually accountable, that's to be determined. But technology is a tool. It cannot be held accountable for its impact. That shouldn't be different whether it's autonomous technology or dumb bombs. Somebody made the decision to deploy it. So I think that fact stands.
Got it. Rita, I think I'm going to ask you one more question, then I'm going to ask you to kind of see what you want to leave us with. Okay.
Yeah.
One of the questions asked, this might be difficult, but given the complexity of this problem, they cite the black box nature of algorithms. What should we do with respect to trust? What do you think, whether it's US, NATO, defense industrial base, how do you think we should approach this issue of trust?
So again, I think it's an empirical question about whether the black box nature itself even matters, right? That kind of goes back to our conversation about explainability and the fact that people are at odds about whether that's such a critical aspect of developing and building and retaining trust, or whether it's something that is of secondary importance to reliability and resilience. What we need to do is we need to study. I'm an academic at heart still. So, and I think that you'd agree with me, even after all of these years in policy and in the real world and whatnot, these are empirical questions. These are questions that we should be asking, and we should be studying them, whether it's, in laboratory conditions, through experiments, through social science, psychology, cognitive science. A whole range of tools and methods and disciplines should be leveraged for a better understanding of this question, because, come to like what I would like us to leave us with is the fact that it's critical. It's critical for us to be able to get the most out of what autonomy and AI promise to deliver in terms of the military capabilities that they promise to enhance. And even more fundamentally, it's critical for our ability to achieve the broader strategic goals that we are interested in. Because all of this hype around AI, and I mean, I appreciate the opportunity to work at CSET and my job and whatnot, but this hype is going to persevere only as long as it keeps on proving itself. It keeps on demonstrating its utility. If it doesn't seem viable, attainable, or useful, then there's a lot of other places where we could be spending money on, right? So I think the potential is massive and phenomenal and incredible, but there are problems to solve before we can really, capitalize on it.
Rita, thank you. Thank you for the great work and the presentation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Reggie. This was a great conversation. And thank you everybody for these amazing questions. It's really, really smart. And I enjoyed it. Please do, visit our website, have a look at the reports, and reach out if you have any questions or want to talk further.
Thank you, Rita. That was just terrific, and I couldn't have put it better myself. On behalf of CSET, I want to thank our colleague and featured speaker, Dr. Margarita Konaev, along with moderator, Dr. Reginald Brothers. Many thanks as well to all of you for attending and for your thought-provoking questions. We're sorry we couldn't get to them all. And as it is, we went into extra innings, so we appreciate the many of you who are still with us for that. And thanks to Rita and Reggie for your additional time. Once again, Rita's suite of reports is linked on CSET's website in the page corresponding to this event as well, and we'll place the link in our follow-up email tomorrow. And we'll soon share news of our next event. In the meantime, we appreciate you being with us here today. Stay safe, and we hope to see you again, if only virtually, real soon.